And that was a little later too, which I think is a natural thing. Suddenly we've got live.
Ringo Starr wasn't always a fourth member of the Beatles, welcomed with open arms like a brother. No, he walked into the band as a guy everyone thought was just a filler, a replacement who might be lucky to even last. He smiled through the humiliation, stood tall under the spotlight, while the press turned him into a punchline, mocking him as the luckiest drummer in the world. Yet, behind closed doors, whispers circulated about whether he truly belonged. Even within the band, one member treated him like a hired hand. And then, a cold betrayal from someone who had been like family. But after all these years, Ringo is finally speaking out. He's revealed the names of those he could never forgive. And trust me, you won't believe who's on that list. The story of Ringo's anger didn't begin on the iconic Abbey Road sessions, or even in the chaotic heights of Beatlemania. It began long before, when a young Richard Starkey lay in a hospital bed, struggling through childhood illnesses. In wartime Liverpool, he was often more familiar with the sterile smell of hospital rooms than with the sounds of classroom. Peritonitis, tuberculosis. These weren't just physical battles. They were battles that kept him away from school, making him feel like he was always playing catch-up with everyone else. By the time he emerged from the hospital, he was a quiet, shy kid, forever wondering if the other children knew something he didn't. That insecurity stuck with him. Even when Ringo joined the Beatles, he always felt like the one with the shortest resume. He wasn't the flashy one, not the one with the most technical skill. But his drumming was steady, dependable, and in a world of chaos and rock and roll frenzy, that was what the Beatles needed. In 1962, when they were looking for a drummer stronger than Pete Best, they found Ringo. He was the upgrade, the guy who would make the difference. Or so they thought. But when Ringo walked into EMI for his first session, he was greeted with humiliation. Producer George Martin didn't believe he was good enough. He brought in session drummer Andy White to play the drums on Love Me Do instead of Ringo. Imagine that. You join the biggest band in the world, and they immediately bring in someone else to play your part. That moment never really left him, and decades later, Ringo would admit that Sting had never fully healed. He had to endure the fact that his first big hit wasn't because of his talent, but because of his friends. And the press wasn't any better. They called him the least talented Beatle, saying all he could do was keep time. The world laughed, dismissing him as a guy who just played steady beats while Lennon and McCartney created the magic. Inside the band, it wasn't much better. John and Paul wrote the songs, George fought for his voice, and Ringo. Well, Ringo was a guy who sang novelty tunes, played the steady rhythm, and occasionally made everyone laugh. But that was it. Nothing more. But things shifted when Brian Epstein, their manager and stabilizing force, passed away in 1967. The Beatles lost their anchor, and suddenly, Ringo found himself trapped between three overpowering egos. And out of all of them, there was one person who made him feel smaller than the rest. Paul McCartney. Paul was relentless. He was the one who pushed the band to work even when they didn't want to. The one who stayed late, writing endlessly, organizing the sessions, forcing the others to keep working, even when they wanted to take a break. He wasn't just writing songs. He was controlling everything, how the songs were played, what they sounded like. For Ringo, it felt less like collaboration and more like domination. He later admitted that Paul was the one who made the phone calls, always pushing him harder, never giving him a chance to breathe. But it wasn't until the White Album sessions in 1968 that it all broke. Paul, obsessing over every little detail, kept making Ringo redo the same simple drum pattern over and over. Finally, in frustration, Paul sat at the drum kit himself and showed Ringo how it should be done. For Ringo, that wasn't just a correction. It was a confirmation that he was expendable, that he was just a guy who kept the beat, nothing more. That was the breaking point. Ringo walked away from the band. He disappeared for 2 weeks, leaving the others to struggle on without him. And to this day, he still speaks about the pain of being treated like a piece of equipment, not a true partner in the band. If Paul didn't trust his drumming, then Ringo's place in the Beatles had been a lie all along. Ringo's story is one of resilience. It's about overcoming the odds, about walking into a world that never seemed to want him and proving, against all the doubts, that he belonged. It's about the quiet strength that kept him going through the toughest times, and how, even after everything, he rose above the hate, the betrayal, and the doubt. What was Ringo even doing there? It's a question that must have crossed his mind more than once. Paul's perfectionism kept the Beatles' standards at the highest level, but it came at a cost. The others began to feel like nothing more than session musicians, playing on their own records. And for Ringo, who already carried the weight of being the replacement and the least talented, having Paul literally take a seat at the drum kit was like watching his worst fear come to life. But here's where it gets even more complicated. These two men, who once seemed like polar opposites, eventually became each other's last link to the Beatles. In 2015, Paul stood on stage at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and inducted Ringo as a solo artist, making light of their past by joking about inducing him into the hall. In the years that followed, they even toured together, shared the stage, and McCartney referred to their bond as very special. It was an unexpected turn of events, considering everything that had come before. And then there was John, Ringo's anchor, the one Beatles member he always admired. Even during the turbulent times, John was the heart of the band, the one who kept everything grounded. For years, Ringo had stood quietly behind him, a steady presence at his side. But in 1968, something began to change. At first, it was subtle small shifts in John's behavior that Ringo couldn't quite place. But soon it was undeniable. Yoko Ono. It wasn't just that she stood beside John anymore. She became a permanent fixture in the studio, in the creative process, in the conversations. She inserted herself into the very fabric of the Beatles' world. For Ringo, this was not just strange, it was unsettling. The Beatles had always operated as a closed circle, a brotherhood of four voices, four opinions. But now, there was a fifth presence in the room, and it seemed as though only one of them mattered. Ringo wasn't shocked by Yoko's boldness. He was stunned by John's reaction to her. Instead of defending the band, John sided with Yoko. He once looked at Ringo and said, "Just keep it even. That's enough." To a drummer, who already felt like the odd one out, this stung deeply. The message was clear. Your opinion doesn't matter. Her opinion is what counts. The tension grew with each passing day. George Harrison, frustrated beyond belief, finally snapped. John's response? He slammed the table, accusing the others of disrespect. But this wasn't about music anymore. It was about loyalty. And in Ringo's eyes, John had shifted his loyalty, not just to Yoko, but to a relationship that consumed him entirely, leaving no room for anyone else. Ringo could feel the Beatles falling apart, and it hurt him more than he could put into words. He had always valued peace, and now it seemed the heart of the band had been taken away, replaced by something that was tearing them apart. Ringo later acknowledged what everyone else was too afraid to admit. The band was already drifting. In a rare, heartbreaking memory, Ringo described visiting John in New York in 1980. It was a time of laughter, of ease. It felt like they were still brothers, still the Beatles. But just weeks later, John was assassinated. The unresolved pain, the unspoken words, vanished in an instant, and with it, any chance for closure. Then there was Allan Klein, the outsider who slowly but surely turned the Beatles into enemies. At first, his arrival didn't feel like a big deal. It didn't feel like the dramatic entrance of someone who would change everything. Instead, it felt like relief. With Brian Epstein gone and Apple Corps in financial turmoil, the Beatles were drowning in chaos. Klein seemed like the solution to their problems. But Ringo would later see it as another step in the unraveling of everything he had once loved. They were global icons, adored by millions, but somehow they couldn't balance their own books. Ringo, tired of the polished executives who talked a good game but never delivered, found a strange kind of comfort in Allan Klein. Klein was different. He was blunt, aggressive, and willing to fight. He was a hustler, the kind of man who promised to protect them and make things happen. It was a kind of energy Ringo was drawn to, a stark contrast of polite, corporate nonsense that had plagued their business dealing for years. At first, it was John who embraced Klein. George followed suit quickly, and then, wanting stability more than anything else, Ringo signed on. Ringo later explained why he was drawn to Klein. He was a hustler, and I felt it was time I had someone hustling for me. But behind the charm and bold promises, Klein had a strategy one that understood the cracks within the band. He saw the tension between them, the fractures in their brotherhood, Paul's need for control, John's growing restlessness, George's resentment, and Ringo's desperate desire for peace. Klein saw it all and knew exactly how to weaponize their loyalty, how to turn their weaknesses into leverage. The meetings, once heated debates, became full-blown battlegrounds. What was once a group of friends with shared decisions turned into a war zone, with 3 Beatles on one side and Paul on the other. Within months, Klein had expertly turned internal tension into a full-scale rupture. The breaking point came when Paul refused to sign a contract with Klein. Ringo, John, and George, feeling the pressure of their own dissatisfaction, chose to move forward without Paul. That decision would prove catastrophic. In 1970, Paul sued the other 3 Beatles and Klein, and the lawsuit tore apart whatever shred of friendship remained between them. Every past wound, every unsaid word deepened. Distrust festered, resentment grew, and regret settled in. The brotherhood, once united by music and shared dreams, was shattered not just by egos but by signatures and courtrooms. It was a painful realization their bond had been destroyed by money, power, and betrayal. And then came the cruel twist of fate. By 1973, Ringo realized just how wrong his trust in Klein had been. The man he had relied on to protect the Beatles had mismanaged funds, manipulated contracts, and used their names to his own advantage. Klein was fired, but the damage was done. The Beatles, once a unified force, were now scattered, haunted by the ghosts of their past decisions. Ringo, John, and George came to a grim realization they had been used, played like pawns in a game of power. And in a moment of raw honesty, George confessed something devastating to Alan Steckler. He said, "The only way the Beatles can ever get together again is if Alan isn't there. I'm ready. So is Ringo." That confession says it all. For Ringo, Allan Klein wasn't just a manager. He represented the deepest betrayal. The man he trusted to protect the band became the one who ensured they would never stand on a stage together again. It was a heartbreaking twist, especially for Ringo, who already felt like the outsider, the one who had to fight for his place. And what about Ringo's real talent and legacy? When the dust from Klein's departure finally settled, Ringo was left with a brutal question. Was he really the least talented Beatle? He'd heard the jokes for years about the drummer who got lucky, the one carried by Lennon and McCartney. After the breakup, those words echoed louder than ever. There was no band left to hide behind, no iconic trio to back him up. But time would reveal what the critics never saw. The very sessions where Paul would take his seat behind the drums and John would dismiss his contributions were also the ones where producers realized something crucial. Ringo was the one who kept the band on track. He was almost always in time, never losing tempo, a constant presence when the others drifted. George Martin, who had replaced him on Love Me Do, later admitted Ringo wasn't just reliable, he was the band's backbone. He was a click track, the human anchor that held everything together. And when younger drummers began to study Ringo's parts, they quickly discovered they couldn't replicate his feel. His groove was unique. As the years went on, the narrative shifted. Ringo's solo career produced real hits, and legendary musicians like Harrison, Clapton, Dylan, and Elton John kept calling him back to play. They didn't come to him because of nostalgia, but because his rhythm brought something special to their music. Even Paul, the same man who once corrected his drumming, would later induct Ringo into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. Today, Ringo's legacy isn't about luck or simplicity. It's about precision, feel, and endurance. He wasn't the least talented Beatle. He was a heartbeat, the steady foundation that allowed the other 3 to soar. And as time moves forward, it becomes clearer and clearer. Ringo wasn't the weak link. He was the piece everyone overlooked, the one no one truly appreciated, until he proved his worth not just for a moment, but for half a century. So, now that you've seen the full picture, who do you think Ringo resented the most in his heart? Was it Paul, John, or Allan Klein? Drop a comment below and let me know which part of the story shocked you the most and why. And if you want more brutally honest behind-the-scenes stories like this about rock legends, make sure to like the video and subscribe. There's still plenty of secrets hiding behind those smiling faces.